Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Be-hive webinar on working in a COVID world. Now, I hope you're all keeping safe and well wherever you are. My name's Colin Godfrey, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm a senior counsel in the employment team here at Taylor Wessing. Let me introduce you to your speakers today. We have Helen Farr, who's a partner in the team. Helen.
Hi, everyone.
We've also got. Sorry, Helen. We've also got Roxanne Davey, who's a senior associate in the employment team, and Katie Davenport, who is an associate in the team. So the impact of COVID-19 on the employment world keeps us on our toes constantly. We've obviously just had the announcement from the Chancellor this afternoon about the new job support scheme, which is going to kick in once the furlough scheme ends at the end of next month. As an aside, if anyone listening would like any support or guidance about what that means for you and your business, please obviously do feel free to reach out to us or your usual TW contact directly, and we'd be very happy to support you. So what are we actually going to be talking about today? Well, in this ever-changing world that we live in, you might be forgiven for forgetting that there was another government announcement way back on Tuesday of this week. And this webinar looks a little bit different to how it did before the government changed its tune on returning to work and working from home. Now, part of the challenge for all of us has been coping with these sort of changes happening all the time and trying to predict what the future is going to bring. So whilst we were hoping to discuss how you've all been dealing with returning to the office, that now looks like it might have to wait for a little bit. So instead, what we're going to be starting with today is Helen discussing working from home. Now, this is more important than ever, and whilst many of us have fallen into home working arrangements, Helen's going to be covering a number of important considerations that come from this now being the norm for a lot of businesses. Then we'll be turning to Katie to talk us through what's been happening in relation to businesses bringing staff back to the office, including how that's been impacted by the change of the guidance announced on Tuesday. She'll also be looking into the future a little and addressing what businesses should be thinking about, even now, really, with an eye on finally bringing people back into the office or on site. And then finally, we're going to have Roxanne, who will be looking at the options for businesses if employees refuse to return, as and when that is the case, and how the new normal will sit alongside the legal right that employees have to make flexible working requests and the extent to which we might see that becoming more frequent. Now, we're really keen to make this session as interactive as we possibly can, so we'll have a number of polling questions for you, so keyboards at the ready. We'd love it if you took the opportunity to answer questions and give your feedback as we go. There'll also be an opportunity for you to ask questions throughout the webinar, and you'll see that there's a Q&A box towards the bottom of your page. So do feel free to pop your questions in there. We'll try and cover as many as we possibly can during the course of today's session. And if we do run out of time, we will make sure that you are responded to after the end of today. And finally, you'll also see that there's a resource box which has a number of articles and information about supporting businesses at this time. So do feel free to click on the links at your leisure. So without further ado, let me start by asking Helen. So Helen, what does home working now look like in this strange new world?
Well, thanks, Colin, and welcome to everyone. I think the reality is that home working, especially for office workers, is becoming the norm. Obviously, following the decree that we had in March that we should all be working from home, if at all possible, many of us who are working in offices have absolutely become used to working from home. And the reality is that I'm conscious that some listening may never have been actually even been back to the office, and those that have been prevented from returning on a full-time basis. So as Colin said, we want to make today quite interactive, and we have a question for you, which relates to your position and your business's position about working from home. And well, the first question is, does your business plan to allow employees to work from home permanently? And there's two options, yes or no. So if you can quickly just click on those options. I'll give you a couple of minutes just to answer away, and then we'll see what your thinking is on that point. I'll just give you a couple more minutes. You can see the results are coming in now. So we've got 88% of you are saying no, and 11% are on yes. And actually, I think that's really interesting. I mean, what we are seeing is there's obviously been some quite high-profile examples of quite big names saying that they're simply not going to go back to work in an office, and I've put Google, Facebook, Twitter up, but also Schroders has also been very public about their position, which is that they're not planning to return. But I think most of us, and that's borne out by your response, are taking a much more measured approach. I'm aware of some businesses that have, even pre the Tuesday announcement, announced that they're not going to be reopening their offices until January. But for most of us listening and on this call today, I think the position is that they are going to, will be expecting people to sort of come back to work in some sense. But clearly, we've got to juggle again with the impact of the announcement of the 22nd of September on businesses that have partially reopened. And in response, I think we've had a question about that. What I was talking about there was working from home permanently depending on your hours of work. So I hope that reflects the answers that we've had through. So moving on to look at home working, whether people are working at home all the time or part of the time, there are a number of considerations that I think we have to bear in mind. And obviously for most of us at the moment, we're working from home permanently, albeit likely on a temporary basis pending the outcome of the pandemic. And I think some of the issues that businesses are considering are points like, how do you reinforce culture? And absolutely it's tough, because the starting point is culture is normally how things are done around here. And how do you reinforce that when people aren't physically present and don't get a sense of how you like things being done? Communication is also tough. We're all communicating virtually. There's no longer that ability to have spontaneous conversations that we used to have, a kind of coffee room, water cooler type chat. We all have to agree a time, and so that spontaneity and sort of feedback and generation of ideas is lost, which is incredibly valuable for most businesses. I think some managers are struggling too. It's tough to manage people remotely and also to keep them accountable. And what we're also seeing is, for some individuals, their productivity is lower. Others are actually going the other way and working incredibly hard, maybe probably too hard. But some people do find it hard to stay motivated and to keep focused, because working from home is not their choice. And also security is an issue. Slightly alarmingly, a report over the summer from Barclays confirms that fraud has increased by 66% in the first 6 months of this year in comparison to the last 6 months of 2019. The temptation is huge when everyone's working from home to potentially try to sort of get away with it. So we're almost facing a perfect storm, in that it's hard for businesses to detect fraud and misconduct, and it's easier potentially for employees to commit those kind of offences. From a people issue as well, for those of you who are managing your staff, I know some have found it harder to hire staff virtually. Integration is also another problem. And again, going back to those points about understanding the culture and getting to know your colleagues and teammates. Many people simply don't want to work at home, and I'm conscious that a lot of people don't have a fantastic home working environment. You know, people managing from their bedrooms, are working from the kitchen table. They don't have a desk, they don't have a proper chair with lumbar support. They're not really kitted out to work from home, and so that's tough. And at the end of the day, we're all social beings, and it's great to have social interaction, and we benefit from that. So because of that sort of blurring of the work-life balance, and because of the fact that people do feel that they are missing out by not being in the office, what we are also struggling with is a large increase in problems with mental health. And there's also, for those who are thinking about a more permanent move towards home working, there's a couple of sort of longer term problems which people are starting to discuss. And the first is what's called the digital divide, which really applies to lower paid workers who perhaps are struggling to access good broadband, and they don't have good facilities at home. And there are concerns that some jobs will be just inaccessible to certain sectors of the population if the move to permanent home working is a longer term post-pandemic move. And there's also a sense that for those businesses who will be having a sort of more home working as a longer term option, but giving people the choice, that certainly from surveys that have been taken from businesses that in Japan and other countries where they've been looking at this topic pre-lockdown, their findings are that managers tend to be very keen to stay at work. They're much more likely to be seen to be in the office, and that sadly those who choose to work from home may be overlooked for promotion and are likely not to be viewed as committed as those who are there working in the office. And so I think over longer term, there could be a risk of indirect sex discrimination claims. That's another point to think about. With all of those issues, it's interesting to look at a company called GitLab, which is a San Fran tech company. And their model has always been to work remotely. So they currently have 1,300 staff working in 67 countries, so globally, all working from home. And they've been very vocal about some of the challenges that they've had in following that model. But their way of coping is to appoint what they've called a head of remote working. And that person their job is to oversee and manage remote working and how successful it is across the workplace. And I think it's worthwhile just mentioning a couple of points that they've introduced in terms of remote working to make it more successful and so that businesses don't lose out. So one measure that they've taken is to replicate informal chat. So it's a requirement that everyone undertakes or has a period of 3 hours a week where they literally are expected to be talking to colleagues, co-workers, people in the business across the world. They have introduced new rules about meetings, so that every meeting has to have a 5-minute period at the end where people can talk internally or for a break, and obviously that's internal meetings, not with clients. That managers are also, there's no differentiation. Everyone has to work remotely, and that's in part to avoid that them and us sort of culture arising. And it's interesting because the CEO has been reported as saying that it's really hard to make remote working work, and his view is that trying to do it, which we all are now, when managing staff in the office, is asking for trouble. So that moves me on to my next question, and actually I can see that someone's already put a question in the chat box about this, which is, are you receiving requests to work from home outside the UK? And yes or no. And the reason I've flagged this is because it seems to be becoming more of a trend, but it's interesting to get a sense of your view. So if you could quickly just answer yes or no, I'll give you all a few minutes and then we can talk about the results. Oh, that's interesting. So the vast majority of you are now receiving requests to work from home outside the UK, and that sort of tallies with certainly some of the requests that we're starting to see as a team. And I think, I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Home can be anywhere, and at the moment, a lot of people are taking the opportunity to, you know, go and work abroad. And in fact, the Bahamas is very, many of you may have seen this, they've just introduced a new visa where you can go and work there for a year. And I do know a couple of clients have had sort of cheeky requests from their staff saying, can we go and spend a year working in the sun? But there are a number of risks that you need to be aware of if you are going to accept that kind of request. I think the starting point that you all would need to be aware of is that if someone is based outside the UK, even if they're working under a UK employment contract, it's likely that they will enjoy the benefit of mandatory local employment terms. And those can vary, and they can maybe relate to sort of specific terms, so out of work, holidays, benefits, etc. But undoubtedly there will be additional requirements, or there may be additional requirements on termination. And so you may result in a scenario where you have to sort of balance the two jurisdictions approach, certainly on termination, which is less than ideal. Immigration is an obvious concern. At the moment, obviously, we are able to work visa-free across the EU. But as you'll know, from January, that is changing, and the visa requirements for working will change and will be dependent on a country by country basis. Tax is also going to be an issue because it's likely that the individual will be subject to tax in the local in the country where they're working, if they're working for any lengthy period. And there may be an issue for you as a company if it's deemed that you've established a permanent establishment there. Social security, again, is another concern, and certainly the current rule across the EU anyway is that if you're spending more than 25% of your time working in that country, you are expected to pay social security contributions in that state. And data processing, again, is another legal risk, which, so if you're processing, or the individual's processing data as part of their job, then that may be an issue too, that you're going to need to take specific advice to be clear that they can do so and that they're doing so in a lawful manner. So with all of those risks, what are our clients doing? Well, I think the starting point is that many managers and employees need to be aware of this. And the reason I say that is because we've had some cases where people have sort of slipped through the net. Businesses simply weren't aware that they were there working, and it's sort of come out over time. So managers and employees need to understand that there is a risk, and they shouldn't just unilaterally decide to relocate without discussing the position internally. For that reason, we've been working with clients to set up a policy with various sort of business reasons and justification in terms of the scenarios where requests may or may not be granted. But I think what's essential is that you have a team, perhaps with business and HR leaders in that team, who can approve applications on a case-by-case but consistent basis. And I think what you'll appreciate from my earlier points is that you do need to take local advice on all of those issues. I think the safe advice is, if you are going to grant a request, do it for a temporary and short-term basis. And some businesses, I'm aware of, are literally saying we're not going to allow people to work outside the UK for longer than a month, so it's sort of an extended holiday. Others have perhaps said up to 3 months, but I think you do need to take consideration of the jurisdiction where the individual is working and the likely impact on his or her role by agreeing that request. So if you are going to think about allowing either some or all employees to work from home permanently, the their terms and conditions do need to change. And there's a number of areas for you to consider, which I'll just flag up on this slide. The first is health and safety, and Katie's going to look at some of the health and safety issues when you're working from home. Confidentiality is key. You need to be confident that not only do employees understand about the need to protect confidential information, but that they've got somewhere where they can shred papers, stuff is kept securely, and that's especially an issue if you know that people are perhaps, in a flat share or sharing with others who aren't necessarily family members and may have access to company information. Data protection is also important. People need to be working securely. They have to have secure systems that protect your data and make sure that there's no inadvertent data breach. Place of work, you need to be very clear about that. And if there is an expectation that people come back to the office, however infrequently, that needs to be clearly stated. And I think, given all the health and safety concerns we're facing with, people struggling with mental health, it's definitely worthwhile reinforcing the need for a lunch break and compulsory rest breaks in that contract too. That protects you, but it also reminds the individual that they shouldn't literally be logging on as soon as they get up and logging off just before they go to bed. There is an expectation that they have to look after themselves too. But the key question is, will you take the approach that some business leaders are starting to talk about, which is, well, if everyone's working from home, why do we need to pay them as much? And there's been some quite high-profile people coming out with comments on that, so people like Helena Morrissey. And in fact, Facebook have also said that they're planning on reducing people's pay on the basis that they're all going to be working from home permanently. So that's an interesting business decision for you to decide. A couple of other points: insurance. People do, if they're working from home permanently, need to check their home insurance covers it, and also their mortgage, that there's no condition that prevents them from working from home as part of their mortgage policy. So just to wrap things up, how are you going to support these new arrangements? Well, I do think, given the complexities and the fact that working from home is likely to be with us for some time to come, given the COVID pandemic, it's definitely worthwhile making sure that someone within the business is responsible for home working and is managing and responding to the needs of the business in that sense. It would be good to update your home working policy, and I know lots of you would have already done that. Think about data protection and confidentiality considerations too. But I think for many of us, the reality is we're going to have to be responding to the need to manage two concurrent working environments, those who are working remotely and those who are working from the office, and continue to develop systems and processes accordingly. And I'm now going to hand back to Colin. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That was really informative. And just picking up a couple of points and questions that have been raised. I can see there's been a question about what percentage of time someone needs to be spending in another country in order to trigger social security contributions in that country. And I have to profess that tax, it goes a little bit above my head, but I think it does tend to depend on the country involved and the specific circumstances, as opposed to there being a one-size-fits-all rule around a certain percentage of time triggering obligations. There's also issues in relation to dual tax treaties between different countries that impact on which country in which you need to continue, whether or not you need to continue deducting social security in the UK, or whether or not it needs to be deducted in another country. So that's probably one for some specific tax advice depending on the country and the circumstances involved. And then just a point from one of our erstwhile immigration colleagues, Vicky, who mentions quite rightly that if you have any sponsored visa nationals, so if you're sponsoring any overseas workers, then it's also important to pause when you're considering remote working arrangements, just to make sure that you're weighing up your wider obligations to the UK visas and immigration in relation to your obligations to monitor what that person is doing and various other things. So if that is something that applies to you, then do seek some specific advice on that as well. And so
Colin, just to come back to that question about the social security, just to be clear, it's definitely 25%, that's in the EU, and I would completely endorse your advice about sort of non-EU countries where you would have to take specific advice on that. But the position is going to change anyway post-Brexit, so that's a kind of a snapshot for the current position. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. So now we, I suppose, start to cast our eye into a little bit further down into the future than we were hoping. But I think it is always important to think about what a return is going to look like, because it will happen at some stage. And so let me ask Katie. Katie, what have been your experiences of what businesses' attitudes have been so far to getting employees back to work?
Hi, Colin. Yeah, so unfortunately this was something that we thought would be good to talk about a few weeks ago when everybody's returns to the offices were in full swing. And obviously the past few days have really reversed that. But prior to Tuesday, I think we'd seen actually quite a big uptick in offices reopening, particularly when September rolled around. But there has been quite a range of responses. So most have done some kind of return to an office environment, whether that's on kind of a rotating basis, so bubbles of 1 week on, 1 week off, or a slightly more voluntary basis, so suggesting that people should come in maybe 2 or 3 days a week, but leaving it up to employees to decide when that should be. But then on the other hand, a few offices, as Helen mentioned, have even from the outset said that they weren't going to reopen until at least January 2021. So yeah, from what we've seen, a lot of companies have worked out their maximum capacity based on the government guidelines around social distancing, and kind of put it in place from there. So whether it's been a desk booking system or kind of a trust-based, more informal system, there's been a variety of approaches, but obviously nobody has really been able to get back to 100% unless they had a particularly spacious office to start with. Common to everybody, I think, is that there has been fairly little appetite to force employees to return to the office. It's been quite a softly approach, even when we're entitled to ask employees to come back, which has been a big shift from pre-COVID, where I think it was almost expected that most employees would attend the office on some basis, except for obviously the newer startup companies who are only ever remote. And I think Dyson made an example of themselves in April or May when they decided to require all employees to come back into the office, and had to backtrack quite quickly when they had a quite public outrage about it. But obviously this is all caveated by the fact that as of, I think it's today, that the government guidance comes in, that office workers should work from home where they can. The experience that we've seen so far, I mean, the government guidance has been limited, as it always has been. So I think we're hoping that some more up-to-date guidance will be released. But for the time being, all we know is from Boris Johnson's speech on Tuesday lunchtime in the Commons, and also Tuesday evening, where he said, work from home if you can. But our experience of that is that it's been interpreted slightly more loosely than it was the first time round. I think because there's not the nationwide lockdown that we had before, a lot of employers are still allowing employees the discretion to come into the office if they feel that they need to. And also there's been a bigger emphasis this time round on employees being able to come in if they think it's beneficial to their mental health. Again, going back to what Helen said, it's really recognising the fact that humans that work in an office environment and they're used to social contacts just tend to be quite either struggling, or they're just not used to working from home for days on end. So I think there's been more of a recognition this time round that yes, the government guidance is to work from home if you can, but if you can is slightly more widely interpreted. So moving on to a question for everybody listening. I suppose it's all quite recent changes, so you may not have a formal plan in place yet, but we were just interested to see how your business has reacted to the new guidance that came out on Tuesday. So are you in the group that hasn't returned to the office at all anyway? Or perhaps you will always work remotely? Secondly, had you started a return program but have now shut down completely? Thirdly, allowing staff to attend work if they want to, or forcefully requiring staff to attend work, which I think seems to be the less common response, but it would be interesting to see. So if I move on to see what the responses have been. Wow, okay, so 83% saying that staff are still able to return to the office if they want to, which I think is quite there's a large shift from what was done the first time round, where the majority of offices shut completely and access was limited to absolutely only those that were determined to be business critical. So if and when we do get to a more general return to the office, what do you need to be thinking about? Health and safety is obviously the big one. It's been at the forefront of everything this entire pandemic. Employers have always had a duty to protect the health, safety and welfare of their employees, but I think for most in HR and as in employment law, it's always been not necessarily at the forefront of day-to-day employee issues, particularly in an office-based environment where risks just aren't what they are in, for example, a building site where it's a bigger issue. So it's always been a duty, but now employers are finding themselves having to really think about it more than they perhaps were. Similarly, something that may not have been widely familiar a few months ago is the concept of a risk assessment. So there's always been a general risk assessment in place or required to put one in place for a workplace, but potentially quite brief and only really used in specific circumstances. For example, if you've got a pregnant employee, you need to assess the dangers to them in their work environment. The government has now introduced a requirement for all employers to carry out a specific COVID-19 risk assessment. And this needs to be written down if you have 5 employees or more. And the government expects the risk assessment to be published on your website if you have 50 or more employees. It's not mandatory, but the feeling is that I think most employers are complying, not least to reassure staff that they're taking all the right steps. So risk assessments are designed to help employers identify what the hazards are in a business, determine how likely it is that someone could be harmed, and then take steps and decide on an action plan to eliminate that risk. So when it comes to COVID-19, the risk assessments focus on all the usual things of hand washing, ventilation, increased cleaning, the social distancing of 2 meters, or at least 1 meter if 2 meters can't be achieved, and then minimizing transmission. So it's the potential requirements to wear masks, for example, in lifts or stairwells or more communal areas. So all these new host of measures, which 6 months ago wouldn't have crossed anybody's mind, are now kind of core to the return to the office experience. And lastly, on the health and safety point, the government guidance is quite clear and comprehensive and is separated based on the type of employer. So there's a specific area for office space, specific area for hospitality, etc. And it really spells out what employers are expected to do from a health and safety perspective. And then secondly, there's the travelling to work section, which I think has been, particularly in London, a big concern. So whilst employees might be happy to return to the office, they aren't happy about having to commute or get the train. And initially the government started out saying that those who could walk or cycle or drive into work should do so, but until recent days that had expanded, and there was a big push to get employees back onto public transport. But employees might be nervous about this, so what is it that employers can do to help with this once we do get back to return to the office? Some examples have been allowing staggered start times. So there's been a relaxation of the typical 9 to 5 to allow employees to get on a train when they wish to. And you should be encouraging employees to discuss with you or the HR manager about their particular concerns, because people are varying levels of nervous and some might be comfortable and some aren't. So it's really about maintaining an open dialogue with your employees about it. And also it's a good time to highlight any alternative scheme, particularly if we're looking at now a return in the spring. If, for example, you use a cycle to work scheme, it's perhaps something worth drawing your employees' attention to. Next, just to briefly touch on vulnerable employees. So these were the ones that, in the height of the lockdown, were identified by the NHS as being either clinically vulnerable or extremely clinically vulnerable and advised to shield. The shielding programme has now finished, but obviously the risk hasn't really necessarily gone away. So if you are aware of employees that were shielding or are deemed to be clinically vulnerable, then it's worth just paying particular attention to those. The government guidance at the moment is that they specifically adhere to social distancing, perhaps more than other groups. But from an employment law perspective, it's also worth noting that those that are clinically vulnerable or extremely clinically vulnerable might have a condition that would qualify them as disabled under the Equality Act. So it's worth paying special attention and making sure that if you need to return them to the office at any point, that you're putting in place any necessary reasonable adjustments. Finally, going on to employer testing. So this has been slightly increasing, we've seen, particularly in high net worth industries. So, for example, some asset management firms have been deciding to test their employees of their own accord due to certain delays in the NHS test and trace. So each test costs upwards of £100. So it's obviously not a permanent solution for any business by any stretch of imagination. But with testing happening about weekly, it's a way of getting employees back into the office and hopefully minimising the risk. But also this itself presents issues because by asking employees to take a test, you're processing their health data, which is protected under the GDPR as a special category. So if you do have plans to privately test your employees, you need to make sure that you're putting in place the right data protection impact assessment documents and also considering the justification for doing so. And now finally, as Helen mentioned, health and safety, the famous buzzword, doesn't stop in the office. It's not a case of out of sight, out of mind. And as an employer, you need to be considering your employees' health and safety whilst they're at home, even if they've chosen to be there. So your duty extends to protecting them whilst they're sat at home. But employees also have a duty to comply, and it's probably in their employment contracts. They will comply with any reasonable health and safety direction given by you. One common way of assessing an employee's home setup, particularly at the moment, given that you can't send someone around to look at it necessarily, is to ask them to complete a self-assessment. So it's a kind of workstation setup risk assessment or survey, just assessing what their setup is at home. At the moment, there's fairly limited requirements for the employer to completely furnish an office. It doesn't go anywhere near that far. But perhaps watch this space if it becomes more permanent and employees potentially expect to be provided with proper equipment when they've been sat on a sofa for 6 months. And it was in the news today that Spain has agreed with trade unions and particular workforce groups that the Spanish employers will be paying for the equipment of their home workers. So not clear if it would be anything that's ever echoed in the UK, but worth bearing in mind. And then on the softer side, it's also worth remembering that health and safety stretches to mental health and well-being as well. It's not just can they get injured physically. And so ways to kind of protect the mental health of employees is scheduling regular check-ins, and also, as Helen mentioned, remind them of the importance of taking breaks, which I think can be quite easy to forget when you're working from home. And that's it from me. So if I pass back to Colin.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. So there's obviously a lot to think about when trying to get people back into the office. Roxanne, this probably picks up on one of the questions that's been posed, which is what happens if, when you do get to the stage of requiring people to come back, an employee refuses a request to come back? How does that play into the employer's considerations at the moment?
Thanks, Colin, and hi, everyone. Let me just move my first slide on here. So, employees refusing to return to work. So, first of all, I think before we kind of look at what you do if they refuse to return, I think it's important for us to kind of look at that question in the context of why employees might not want to return. Because really the reason that they give you for not wanting to return is going to have a significant impact on the way that you approach it. For the purpose of this, I don't propose to focus on the clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable demographic of people that Katie just described. So the people that have a serious health condition, and that's the reason why they don't want to return. Just because I think there's been an awful lot of guidance about that already. And for these purposes, I'm focusing on some of the more nuanced reasons, reasons that maybe don't seem kind of quite as serious as someone having a pre-existing health condition, but that they may use to tell you that they don't want to come to the office in any event. And much of this, I should stress, is focused for in the future when the guidance changes and it's not work from home if you can effectively. It is what we saw the guidance being in the summer, which is, come on, now the government has determined that it's safe for people to start returning to their offices and places of work. So the first one is serious and imminent danger. So in the UK, employees have a statutory right not to suffer a detriment or to be dismissed if they refuse to come to work where the employee considers that in doing so, they're going to be in serious and imminent danger. It's important to note here that the focus is on the employee's reasonable belief. So they must reasonably and genuinely believe that they are in serious and imminent danger in the workplace. It's not really relevant that you may disagree about the level of danger, and the question is whether, from their perspective, it's reasonable for them to think it. Now, where this statutory protection applies, the employee is able to basically stay at home and not come into the office for as long as they consider that they cannot come to work due to that threat. And given that the statutory protection also avoids them suffering a detriment, that does also mean that that would ordinarily be on full pay. That may not be such an issue if they are obviously able to do their entire job from home, but if they are limited in what they can do from home, then that is of note because they should still be on full pay. So if we are working in a COVID world, how does that statutory restriction that has always been around apply to COVID, and does COVID meet the test? And the answer, I'm afraid, is at the moment we don't know because that's yet to be tested in our tribunal. So had we discussed this a couple of weeks ago when the mood music was very much that people should be returning to work and the government was encouraging people to return, I might have felt that that was a relatively weak argument in the specific case of an office worker who had no underlying health conditions or vulnerability, if they were asked to attend an office that was complying with government guidance, enforcing social distancing and limiting capacity in the office and so on. However, given the recent change in guidance from the government, that may have changed. We've got the guidance to work from home if you can, the fear of a second wave, a huge amount of press interest in what's going to happen over the winter. And so I think it is tricky to say. So as I said, we've got yet to see this tested in the tribunal. We do think it's something that they're going to be asked to consider before too long because we think it fairly likely that employees will be relying on this if they haven't already. And it is important to have on your radar. For now, it's clear that the government guidance is to allow people to work from home if they can do so effectively. And it's possible that when that changes and we all start heading back to reopened offices, then this will have been tested and we'll have a firmer answer. But if in the meantime, there are employees who cannot effectively work from home and you're asking them to attend the workplace, the best way to defend against an employee successfully relying on that is to follow all of the government guidance in relation to hygiene, cleaning and social distancing. And have, as Katie suggested earlier, that really clear and open dialogue with your employees so that they know exactly what you're doing, what measures you are taking, and so on, so that you can try and dispel any of their concerns in this regard. If you have employees that do raise it as a reason not to return to the workplace when it's in line with government guidance that they should and can, then you do still need to take it seriously and investigate it as you would any other complaint, giving them all of the reasons why you may not think that's reasonable. And it's possible that through that process you can reassure them and make them also believe that what you are doing is sufficient and does have their health and safety at the forefront. The second one, and Katie touched on this earlier, is public transport. There's been quite a lot of press interest about, what would happen if an employee is perfectly safe with all of the precautions that their employer is taking, but is worried about having to get public transport to and from the office. So the government guidance is that we can all use public transport as long as we wear a mask, if we're not exempt from needing to wear one, but that we should travel safely and walk or cycle if we can. And they've also published some guidance on travelling safely during the pandemic. And that also suggests avoiding the busiest routes and trying to travel outside of peak times and so on. So when the guidance changes and it starts to suggest people should be returning to the office, we would suggest that you do try and accommodate employee requests to travel off peak in compliance with that guidance. And also think about other things that you can do to try and alleviate any employee concerns. So we've seen employers consider things like, and much of this does depend on where your office is based and how your employees in practice travel to the office, but things like increased parking spaces if that's possible, the number of bike racks, things like investing in Cycle to Work schemes, as Katie mentioned. We've also seen some companies let employees expense things like taxis and Uber, and whilst those are still public transport, they are maybe a little different to travelling on a much busier train and so on. That's also something that you could bear in mind, but there is no obligation to provide that. It's just something that we've seen anecdotally. And also to suggest engaging with employees on subjects like travel early on in your planning, because it's likely that, as I mentioned, it's not just what happens when they're within the four walls of the workplace that they're worried about, but also the coming and going. The third one is childcare issues. So as schools and childcare facilities have reopened, there's been lots in the press about whole classes or year groups being asked to stay at home and isolate on the basis of a localised outbreak within a class or year group. And maybe this isn't such an issue right now when more people are at home again. The juggling, of course, does bring its own issues, but when people do start to return again, if that's still the case, then where does this leave employees who are supposed to be returning to the office but suddenly found without childcare, and what are the options for them? So the first most obvious one is to allow them to continue to work from home. And the others are to maybe consider utilising other types of statutory leave that are available for these instances. So we have the statutory right to take parental leave. That's a statutory right for employees who have 1 year's service. They're able to take 18 weeks of unpaid leave to care for a child. It's possible you have a more generous policy, but the statutory right is to unpaid leave, and employees are entitled to a maximum of 4 weeks of unpaid leave per child per year. The second type of statutory leave is also time off for dependents. So that's a statutory right to take time off for emergencies. It's not to be used where the issue is likely to be known about in advance. It is really for emergencies that you can't predict. There's no limit to the amount of time off, but it is expected to be used effectively to put more permanent arrangements in place, so it is intended to be short-term in nature. And as with unpaid parental leave, this is also unpaid, but again, businesses may have more generous policies in place and may consider paying more for that. One thing to bear in mind about your approach when you've got people who are having childcare issues is to bear in mind the risk of indirect sex discrimination claims on the basis that women are traditionally providing more childcare than men. There was quite a lot of research carried out during lockdown, and a lot of that was showing that even though maybe families had women and men working from home, it was the women that were trying to juggle all of the childcare and work at the same time. So do bear in mind that you may get more pushback in relation to a return to work from women on the basis of childcare issues than men, and do bear the indirect discrimination risks in mind when you're approaching those requests from employees. And the final one is a general anxiety about the return. So when we look at these recent measures, there's been talk of them potentially applying throughout the winter and for another 6 months. So if the infection rates continue to increase, we might find ourselves at home until the spring. So for those of you who didn't quite get people back into the workplace over the summer, you may find that some employees, by the time the rules change again, find that they've been at home for a year. And even if concerns about the virus go away, for example, because we've got a vaccine or whatever, that may leave some employees generally quite anxious about a return to the office for all sorts of reasons. And it's important to note here that all of the employment law obligations that you owe to your employees in normal time don't go away. And so, even if employees aren't disabled or have a medical reason why they can't come in, ordinary principles of fairness are still going to apply, and you are still going to owe your employees the duty of trust and confidence. So how would you address this? And it's similar to lots of the guidance that we've been given. Plan early, communicate your plans to staff, ask for feedback, make sure that they know what you're planning and what you're asking of them and when you're asking it of them, and take things in stages so that employees can be ready for it, know what's coming and prepare themselves for it. You may also have a group of employees who do have anxiety, medically diagnosed or other mental health conditions. And with those, you may need to take a more flexible approach and allow a longer period of home working. And just to bear that in mind, there's also the risk that some employees with an actual condition may be protected by the Equalities Act. They may be considered to be disabled. And so it may be considered to be a reasonable adjustment to allow them to work from home for a longer period or to phase the return to work in over a longer period of time. So all of that should be borne in mind when you're thinking about getting people back. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was flexible working. Colin, I think maybe you had something to say about this before we launched into the poll.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Roxanne. I think it's just interesting listening to all of the considerations that employers will need to sort of bear in mind when deciding on how they approach refusals, to think about the fact that actually all employees have a statutory right to request flexible working. And it's interesting to think how that will play as against employers who perhaps in a few months' time will start taking a slightly stronger line on requiring people to come back, and whether or not we're going to see a flood of those types of requests coming in.
Yeah, exactly. And exactly, I know for recent months, we employment lawyers have been talking about whether a flood is likely. And so on that basis, there's a poll question. It should be on your screens now, and it asks you if you've received an increased number of flexible working requests since lockdown began. So I'd be grateful if you could answer that, please. No? Okay, that's interesting. It's funny, so when we were preparing for this seminar, we were talking about this because we said we'd anticipated an increased number of requests, but actually that's not what we've seen with our clients. We haven't seen many of them receiving a significantly higher number of requests, and it looks like a relatively mixed bag there with the answers. So 40% of you have received an increased number of requests and 60% haven't. There's one more poll question, and that is if you're expecting to receive an increased number of requests in the near future, even if you haven't already. So I'll just give you a few moments to answer that too. So I can't see the poll results. Ah, here we go. You are expecting to receive an increased number. Right, okay, even if you haven't already, that's interesting. And then the final question, are you envisaging a more relaxed approach to flexible working requests going forward such that more may be approved? So what are you thinking that your organisation is likely to do when considering flexible working requests? I'll just give you a moment to answer that. No. Oh, 100% no. Okay. So, flexible working requests. So, what's the current legal position with flexible working requests? So, they've been around for some time. You might remember that they started off as a right that was solely related to childcare, but that was broadened so that employees could make a request to work flexibly for any reason in around 2014. So employees with at least 6 months service can make a request, and they can make up to 1 request a year. The obligation is on the employer to deal with the request in a reasonable manner within 3 months, and it's a right to request it, not to be granted it. Having said that, the employer can only reject a request for one of the 8 prescribed business reasons, and that includes things like the inability to reorganise work. I've just seen a comment. Someone said that they said no because they were already rather accommodating pre-COVID. Okay, that's interesting. So how is the Employment Bill thinking of changing the right to work flexibly? And it's interesting you say that because at the start of the year there was discussion about the Employment Bill, and it was intended to amend the right to work flexibly to basically enhance it so that flexible working would become the default unless the employer had a good reason not to agree to the request. And I think that probably is reflective of the majority of our clients' approach to flexible working over recent years. I think that it has been more flexible and more accommodating as time passes. So it's interesting that the law is considering an amendment to reflect that. This hasn't been progressed that much, obviously due to COVID. But I think it is reflective of the fact that attitudes to flexible working are changing and employers are becoming more accommodating of that. So what do you do when you get your requests, even with the law as it stands now? And how do you best protect yourself so that if you do get a significant increase in the number of requests post-COVID, you know how to deal with them and you're not exposing the business to unnecessary risk? So the first bullet point on the slide there is consistency. And that's really key because if now, when you're anticipating that you may get more requests, you take the time to make sure that you've got clear, agreed and well-communicated processes for dealing with the requests, then it should at least make the process fairly straightforward. And that should take a lot of pressure off of the business managers, you in HR, and the employees making the request. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you agree one request to work flexibly or work a 4-day week that you'd need to agree to all of those requests. It does just mean that when you're looking at them all, you should be considering the same things. In terms of consistency and timing, another important point to note is that you don't need to adopt the same approach for people who are asking for similar things or people in similar teams. And what's important is that you look at the way the workforce is operating and whether or not you can accommodate the request at the time that you receive the request you receive. So if you receive a request from one employee and you grant it, and then that basically changes the way that the team needs to work, and you later receive another flexible working request from another member of the same team, if you can no longer accept that request because you have already accepted previous requests, then actually that is okay because you are supposed to be considering the requests in the order in which you receive them. So sometimes you do get employees say, well, someone else was able to work flexibly, why can't I? It's not necessarily a good argument. Of course, you should be bearing in mind things like discrimination and so on, and not necessarily always accepting requests from one type of employee and not from another. But ultimately, just because you have accepted a request in the future, it doesn't necessarily mean that you always need to receive those same requests and accept them. If it means that the work has changed and the way the work has been allocated has changed. One thing that you should bear in mind, though, is that in looking at consistency, you can also consider the long-term implications of any request that you get. It may be that at the moment it looks like it's something you can accept. Everyone can work with it. Maybe you've been working with it already, and this is just formalising something that's already changed. But how will the work change after COVID? How do you envisage your business operating after COVID? And do you think that the request is something that the long-term implications will be sound with? Is it sustainable? The second point on the slide is evidence, and this is one for really if you're thinking of refusing a request. It's really important that you have your basis for refusal ready and any evidence that you intend to rely on there. So employees seeking to return to normality in terms of office hours and attendance at the office will need to evidence why continuing to allow the extent of flexibility that you maybe have been permitting at the moment wouldn't work for the business in the long term. Now, that evidence is likely to differ from business to business, from industry to industry, and it could include a whole raft of things, maybe client complaints about things not being done on time, a failure to hit targets, consistency between different people based in the same office producing different quality of work and so on. But it is important that you have that so that if you are refusing a request, you can explain to an employee exactly why that is and they can see what evidence you're relying on. We do expect employees to dispute these, rejections of flexible working requests more frequently. And so if you can front load that and essentially anticipate the fact that it may be disputed, that's going to be helpful for you in the long run. And the final point then, sorry, I've just checked the time and we're running over a bit, is trial periods. So they've never actually formed part of the legislation, but they are quite a common way of considering if a request will actually work on a permanent basis. So you can agree a request on a trial period, depending on what the request is and how long you think you need, a few weeks, a few months. Make it very clear to the employee that you're not agreeing it on a permanent basis and you are only agreeing it on a trial basis, and essentially see how it goes. Of course, you wouldn't want to accept something on a trial basis that you know is going to be detrimental to the business. But if you genuinely are unsure and want to see how it plays out, then that's definitely an option for you. And I've just seen a question here that's come in. Can you approve a request and then subsequently withdraw the permission because the business needs are not being met? So the request to work flexibly is intended to be a permanent change. So usually no, because usually when you would accept one of these requests, you would make a permanent change to the employee's contract. So that's another reason why a trial period, if you're a bit uncertain, may be the best way to approach it in the first instance. You could even agree a relatively long trial period, like 3 to 6 months, to really give it time to go through. And if you think it's not working, you could then revert to the initial contract. And I'm conscious that we've run over, so that's it. And I think I've answered the flexible working questions, but if anyone's got anything else, then feel free to ask and we can follow up with you afterwards.
Fantastic. Thank you, Roxanne. As you say, we are a little over time, but I think it was really useful to hear all of that information. I do think it is going to be something that's going to come down the pipe in terms of more flexible working requests that we're going to see coming along. So becoming more comfortable and addressing those sorts of issues and understanding how to balance competing requests is definitely going to be something that's going to be really important for us all to cope with. Now, I'm sorry that we didn't manage to cover all the questions that got asked, but what we will do is we'll pick up questions that we didn't manage to get to with the individual people on an individual basis after this webinar. So that just leaves me to thank our speakers, Helen, Katie and Roxanne. You'll see our friendly faces on the next slide here. Do, of course, let us know if there are any particular issues that you are dealing with or that are affecting your business that you'd like us to help with. We will, of course, also be monitoring the detail of the new job support scheme that's been announced today. So look out for some updates from us on what that's going to mean for you and your staff when more information is available. So thank you again for joining us. We hope you stay safe and well and look forward to welcoming you to future webinars over the course of the next few months. Many thanks.